I wish I could come up with something that could signify the new year. I know. What if I make an awesome bell tower to ring in the new year? Hi folks, my name is Leif and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel called Devs and Dice. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through the steps I took to create my own ruined bell tower. The build features a fully playable interior and exterior with multiple floors, and just for the fun of it, I made it with a functioning bell. Perhaps not as cool as the real thing, but nonetheless, it's a fun feature that you can build gameplay around. Perhaps reinforcements will enter the fray when the bell is rung, or warriors around the bell will suffer a strength 3 sonic attack. Now with that out of the way, let's get crafting. One aspect I forgot to mention was that this build is inspired by the bell tower from Cromlech. I saw it in my local hobby store and I thought, that looks neat. I wonder what my take on this will be. So I started the process with some MDF cut through my laser cutter and then some cardstock just to define the walls of the 2 first floors. Now this was tricky because I didn't have my usual masking tape but had to suffice with some packaging tape, which of course works fine, but it just looks shiny instead of seeing clearly where I have added tape. But regardless, this worked pretty good. And as you can see, I was trying to figure out a way to do some interesting stones in the corners of this octagonal building. I did, using my laser cutter, a little bit of a jig there, and then I cut out some XPS foam strips in 1 centimeter thickness and 2 centimeter lengths. Now, these would function as my pillars on the corners of the octagonal building. Now, I wanted to show you a little bit about the process of making these look a little bit more like stone. You separate them, put them in a tub, together with some stones, and then you shake like there's no tomorrow, and voila! You get some nice texture onto the stones. Here you can see this little jig that I made. I'm sure it's not high quality, but it worked for what I want it to do. Specifically to get a nice angle that would face up against the build so that it looked nice, and also it actually supported the build by hot gluing in these bricks. Once I had these on, it was a small task, but a long one, to just start bricking in the normal 10 by 5 by 5 millimeter bricks that I usually use. This will take a while, but it's quite meditative, to be honest. The next problem I had to solve was the actual gate. Now I knew I wanted to call attention to it somehow, make it look different. So I just traced the actual entrance and then I drew out a little bit of an overlay and then I cut into the foam and tried to score where the individual stones would be. Now, this is not my preferred method, simply because I think it usually looks a little bit less good than individual bricks, but I decided, you know what, put that aside, Leif. You need to make it look different and this will suffice. I wish I had known about a solution that I will show you later in the build. But anyways, it looks something like that and it looked pretty good. Now there is another entrance on the 2nd floor. That one is broken, so I just glued that in. And like I said, this is quite meditative, so I recommend listening to an audiobook or a podcast or such. Here is the weakness, quote unquote, in this, because I had to make an identical version of that gate on the inside. It clearly looks fake, and like I said, I made a solution for that later in the build. Now, the actual bottom plates, I decided to go with 1 x 1 centimeter floor tiles, and I think this makes it look good when there's different variations in the sizes of different bricks. Off camera, I glued in some 5mm beams at the corner of the build. Now I'm going to be using this to start putting in some support beams. Good is usually to drill a hole and get some paper clips and pin the actual supports, especially if they're jetting outside of the building, meaning that they don't have all of that much to cling on to. And here you can see I'm drilling into the said support beam, and then I just use some super glue and pin that support into it. Now for the foam ones, I use hot glue instead because I think hot glue works quite well with foam. Now here, just adding a little bit of support to these beams coming out, which will eventually create a walkway on the outside. At this point, I just focused hard and tried to get all of those bricks in, and then eventually I added the 2 support beams on the inside to start thinking about the, let's see, the first floor, I guess you would call it. Now, white glue is my preferred choice when I can, and when it comes to gluing wood on wood generally, yeah, I will go with white glue. I don't know if I'm imagining things, but I tend to think that white glue very rarely fails when you have a wood against wood situation. Then it is actually the most durable, it has flex, so it is a perfect choice. Here I had to actually cut out a little bit, so I was just showing that sometimes you need to cut out even with these small coffee stir sticks. Let that dry overnight and we can see that the first floor looks nice and stable. So now it was back to bricking and back to making that second floor. This went actually quite fast, to be honest. You know, just hunker down, focus, and listen to something and get the job done. Now, one of the problems I had, and I didn't know how to solve this, was the top floor. I wanted an octagonal shape. I wanted it to be made of these coffee stir sticks to look like planking, but I couldn't figure it out. Eventually, I just made a sketch in Illustrator, which is signifying one cell of an octagonal surface. I made it so that one coffee stir stick would cover both ends, so I could be as efficient as possible and use those coffee stir sticks to a maximum. And as you can see, this looked quite nice. But I had to get rid of that paper that I glued, and that was quite easy. Just soaked it with some water and used a steel brush to get it off. Here you can see I finally bought some masking tape, and I'm using this to make sure that I have the substructure for the arches at the top level. First came the scary moment of gluing this platform to the rest of the building, but it turned out pretty good. And previous to this, you saw that if you paid attention, I had made some markings where the platform should go, so I wasn't flying entirely blind. Here I'm just hot gluing in that substructure for the arches on the top floor, and it turned out pretty nice. And then a little bit more supports for the top floor. You can never have enough of these, both from a visual point of view, but also actually from a functional point of view. They really do give it some sturdiness and support. Now here comes the solution that I wish I would have thought about earlier. Those arches at the top floor, you're gonna see them from two directions, both from the inside and the outside. And suddenly it hit me. Leif, you old fool. Why don't you do individual bricks? but just make them slot into the substructure that I define using that thick cardstock paper. Now here you can see I'm using various tools to cut these stones out as neatly as I can. And then I do the same procedure as I do with all of my bricking. I put these into a can and then shake them around, and here comes the brilliance. Use one of those hot wire wands and I cut a slit. This way I can actually slide the stone on the substructure and it will look good from the outside and the inside. Brilliant! Well, I'm sure somebody has done this before, but for me at least it was a stroke of brilliance. Now for the inside of the arches I added some 5mm beams, and I'll be honest, I did that out of laziness because then I didn't have to brick anymore. But you'll see why soon. It was also a happy accident, let's call it. Now when it came to the roof, I thought I wanted a sort of fairy tale arched roof. So I created this somewhat crazy structure and glued it into an octagonal surface. And it just looked wrong, to be honest, so away with that. But the process did show me something that I thought could work. So here I'm cutting some of those 5mm wood beams, and I'm gluing this to an octagonal surface that has just enough surface to allow me to glue these dowels on it. And voila, we have something that could be reminiscent of a roof structure. Now once I have that, I'm gonna start hot gluing in some coffee stir sticks, and this will increase the durability and the stability of the structure. And this, I'll be honest, this was quite tedious, but my advice is pre-cut as much as you can, then hot glue, then just add the boards one by one. In the end, I think it looked pretty good, to be honest. So I was happy with this. Now I ordered one of these from Amazon, and this is, I guess, some sort of servant's bell or whatever. I had no idea what I was doing here, but I drilled a hole through the entire thing, and then I drilled an additional hole, not through it, that would be for the actual structure that would help someone to actually ring the bell. And I want to stress this multitude of times. One of the reasons I like building these complicated builds is because it forces me to do some investigations and research to how the heck does actually church bells work and so on. And one version of it is to have a jetting pulley that basically when you pull the rope, the bell goes back and forth in its own localized arc. Meanwhile, I'm starting to work on the roof while the bell is drying, and here I'm doing some dragon scale shingles, which I cut on my laser cutter. But the top was a problem, but with a little bit of Illustrator and math, I figured out that I could do my own little octagonal hat, I guess you would call it. Now here I'm simply just gluing that onto some thicker cardstock, and then I'm just beveling it with a blunt tool so that the creases becomes nice and neat. And then it's just a simple job to hot glue this together, and voila! We have ourselves a small octagonal hat of sorts. Wasn't that difficult, and I just measured. I didn't even measure, I just made sure it was large enough to cover what I wanted it to cover, and luckily the angle wasn't entirely wrong. So I was happy with that. And putting the roof on the actual build, yeah, that's one way it could look like. Looks very cool. Now remember me saying that it was quite a happy accident with those wooden beams in the corners? Well, just so happens, and this was not thought out or planned by me. The distance that I have for the beams for my bell is the same as the distance for these beams, which sort of makes sense because I wanted it to be across the middle of the octagonal shape. So I just needed to cut out 5 millimeters on the top of these beams, and guess what? This bell could slot in quite nicely. And because I've used the material I have used, there is a little bit of give and flex, but this bell ain't going nowhere. It's stuck there properly without being glued, because the bell is heavy, so it's pulling it down as well. One of the things I like to do with my shingles, even though I used hot glue, is to soak the paper shingles in water and white glue. This gives them a whole lot more sturdiness and a little bit of shine, but it also takes paint better in my opinion. It's not entirely uncommon that people ask me, how can I prime through the airbrush? What's the magic? Well, here's my 2 cents. Regardless of what you're gonna shoot through your airbrush, use thinner. For a full cup of primer, I tend to dilute it by at least, let's say, half or a third. I want to take this opportunity and thank my patrons for their support, and a special shout out goes to my champion and legend level patrons. So thank you Agresomnia, Andreas Winberg, Arjen Angenent, Fredrik Kierskart Lund, Gunnar Byström, Henrik Mannestråle, Hunars Cave, Jason Chastain, Mad Nurse, Magnus Solberg, Teddy, Urban, Anton Hand, Battle Corgi the 7th, Kiwi the Goblin, Niklas Swedenlind, Oliver Granlund, The Elder Kind, and What I Gotta Roll. Thank you guys, you're awesome. After priming all of the building parts black, I generally want to come in with some high flow acrylic, which is a white paint. You can use ink here as well, whatever flows good, I would say. After that has dried, I come in with some burnt umber transparent ink, and I think this is important to mention also that it doesn't matter if it pools. If anything, I would say it's actually better because you should think of it not like a paint but more as you're painting dirt. Now the first paint I probably come in with is some dark gray, and this I generally stipple in. I don't want to cover everything. For the roof, I tend to go with some light gray that I dry brush just to give the wood a little bit of grayness. And here we have a couple of ladders, which I did off camera, and I will try to dry brush all of these wooden parts with this light gray, because it makes it look old and worn. Eventually I'll get to the building, which I will use the same color of light gray to do a dry brush, and trying to think about the direction I'm coming from. Dark sea blue is not only my probably favorite color, but it's also a paint I use for my shingles. I don't know exactly why I like this combo, but I just think it looks classically beautiful. This all is dry brushed with the same light gray, and I tend to go overboard with this because again I want it to look quite old. The cap gets a little bit of a goldish bronze paint, and then I start with the spackle, and this I dilute with water, fill up, and then dry off with a paper cloth. And again, if you look closely, you can see that this building used to be gray, but because we have all of those undertones of brown, dragging that spackle off downwards makes it actually look like the dirt has flowed through the stones, and I like that. I used some texture paste on the bell because I felt like the bell, out of the box so to speak, looked a little bit too pristine, and this is Mordheim. I needed it to look dirty. So I used a collection of different orange and warm brown paints to rust it up. And then I used some tainted gold from Army Painter to dry brush back the gold sensation in the highlights. I love to use posters because I think they tell a story. Usually I start with the official posters at the bottom and then the ones where things went awry at the top. To complement this, I like some nice symbolism and some text written on the walls where anyone would have reached. And this I use white ink to do. Now, again, a question has been asked several times: how do I get my strong tone to come out from the airbrush properly? Well, I use airbrush thinner and flow aid, and I use probably 50-50 or 70-30, I would say. And to top it all off, a little bit of True Blood is blasted out, and it looks gnarly. I'm over the moon over how this build came together, and I think it's gonna look good on my Mordheim board. On that note, I want to share something amazing that happened a couple of months ago. Damien Huggins posted this in the Mordheim Facebook group. And I know this sounds ridiculous, but just seeing this filled my heart with a lot of love, so thank you so much, Damon. Thank you, the Mordheim community, for making me feel welcome. Tearing up here. I want to thank you so much for watching until this point in the video. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.